This episode is brought to you by LifeLock. It's tax season, and we're all a bit tired of numbers. But here's one you need to hear. $16.5 billion. That's how much the IRS flagged for possible identity fraud last year. Now here's a good number. 100 million. That's how many data points LifeLock monitors every second. If your identity is stolen, they'll fix it, guaranteed. Save up to 40% your first year at LifeLock.com/podcast. Terms apply.
This episode is brought to you by Honda. Introducing the all-new, all-terrain Honda Passport Trail Sport, the most off-road capable Honda Passport Honda has ever dreamt up. The Passport features increased ground clearance, roof rails on all trims, and available specially developed all-terrain tires. And you'll stay comfortable with tri-zone climate control and available features like heated and ventilated front seats and a panoramic moonroof. Learn more at honda.com/passport.
Atheists, agnostics, long-haired weirdos, short-haired weirdos, vandals, hooligans.
The government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government.
Welcome to The Politics Guys, a place for bipartisan, rational, and civil debate on American politics and policy. I'm Northern Kentucky University political scientist Michael Baranowski. I'm joined today by my conservative counterpart, Cleveland area attorney and defender of freedom, Jay Carson.
Hey, good morning, Mike.
Hey, Jay. So as I mentioned, we have a bunch of things that we didn't get to on the weekend show. One, because I inadvertently, we were going to talk about it. I screwed up the order, and so sorry about that. But I didn't mean to jump into the story you were going to lead us on. But it's about the Alien Enemies Act and everything that's been involved with that and sending Venezuelan gang members, or maybe not Venezuelan gang members, to El Salvador. And, well, I'll just let you kind of take it from there.
Yeah. So last week, the Supreme Court vacated the TRO that had been issued by the District Court for the District of Columbia, Judge Boasberg, I believe, in a essentially, now there was a dissent, but they, I think all agreed on one thing, and that was that people who were going to be moved or deported were entitled to due process. The dissent took up the issue of, listen, does the president have the power to do this in the first place under the Alien Enemies Act, which I will point out here, Mike, because sometimes statutes are written in poetry, and this is one of them, that whenever there's a declared war between the United States and any foreign nation or government, or any invasion or predatory incursion is perpetrated, attempted, or threatened against the territory of the United States by any foreign nation or government, the president may make a proclamation to do all kinds of stuff, including apprehending these people and deporting them. So I think the dissent raises a good point of, is this a invasion, a predatory incursion, attempted or threatened by a foreign nation or government? I think there's a good argument that it is not. That those are issues we need to sort out, and I'm not sure that the president has this, let's call it summary apprehension, deportation power. Now, I think the president may have powers on the apprehension part under current immigration law. But the court, I think, gets it absolutely right in terms of saying, listen, everybody is entitled to due process. So this is sort of in some ways, it's kind of a, mixed bag for Trump. The TRO is struck down, but he is required to get due process, and process is due for those who may have been deported improperly. So all in all, I mean, if it's me and I'm keeping score, I'm like, look, nationwide injunctions 0, due process 1. So in that sense, I think it's probably a good decision. So your sense, Mike?
Well, first off, I guess I agree with you and the court that everyone deserves due process, though apparently the Trump administration feels like if you're a real bad guy, you don't actually get, you shouldn't get due process, I guess, for some reason.
Or if we think you're a really bad guy.
Yeah, exactly. That's what it boils down to, right? Of course, the whole point of due process is to determine whether you, in fact, are a really bad guy. But, we can do that. That's just inconvenient. But, the argument that the administration is making is a bit convoluted. It's that this Venezuelan gang, Tren de Aragua, TDA it's been labeled a terrorist organization by the State Department. Their argument is that it's effectively acting as an instrument.
As a nation.
Yeah. Exactly. So they're state sponsored or whatever. But of course, then the question I would think to the court is, well, is determining whether or not a foreign country is invading the U.S. a political question? Because if it is, then the court can just say, you know what, this is not, that's a foreign policy thing. We're going to stay out of that, because you could look at precedent to say, well, the president does have the sole authority to recognize foreign governments and make an argument that, well, that extends to formally recognizing groups as being instruments of those governments. And so,
yeah, well, I think that's a compelling argument.
Yeah, I can see if you can make that connection. Though, of course, you can't just pull random people off the streets and say, well, Bob here said that he's part of the gang, and so therefore he's a state agent we can deport without due process. I mean, that, but yeah. And I would argue just the invocation of this is pushes against the limits.
Bob being the arresting officer, or Bob being the gang member?
Bob being the gang member.
Well, I think
sorry. Bob being the confidential informant, whatever, who said,
yes.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
Exactly. So, I mean, the AEA has only been invoked 3 times before this, right? The War of 1812, World War I, and World War II. And so I think, boy, this is an enormous stretch in the first place. But I see your point is that, well, you rule on the due process issue first and sort of let the merits kind of bubble up, essentially. But then, of course, you have these people who are, in really horrifically bad prisons in El Salvador, and you had the one guy on the administrative error, which the administration admits. But they say, well, he's still, a bad guy. It's just we don't want to bring him back exactly. I mean, it's just. Honestly, Jay, I really feel like Donald Trump and some people in his administration feel that if we think you're a bad guy, you shouldn't get the same rights that people we like get. It feels that way to me. What do you think?
Well, let me take a step back.
Okay.
Doesn't everybody feel that way to some extent?
Boy, I hope not.
Me being the exception, right?
Well, I think people with the strong people with any kind of ethics, with any sort of moral code, would say no. Everyone's entitled to certain basic rights and protections. I mean, that's the whole basis of So no.
The #1 selling product of its kind with over 20 years of research and innovation. Botox Cosmetic, out of botulinum toxin A, is a prescription medicine used to temporarily make moderate to severe frown lines, crow's feet, and forehead lines look better in adults.
Effects of Botox Cosmetic may spread hours to weeks after injection, causing serious symptoms. Alert your doctor right away as difficulty swallowing, speaking, breathing, eye problems, or muscle weakness may be a sign of a life-threatening condition. Patients with these conditions before injection are at highest risk. Don't receive Botox Cosmetic if you have a skin infection. Side effects may include allergic reactions, injection site pain, headache, eyebrow and eyelid drooping, and eyelid swelling. Allergic reactions can include rash, welts, asthma symptoms, and dizziness. Tell your doctor about medical history, muscle or nerve conditions including ALS or Lou Gehrig's disease, myasthenia gravis, or Lambert-Eaton syndrome, and medications, including botulinum toxins, as these may increase the risk of serious side effects. For full safety information, visit BotoxCosmetic.com or call 877-351-0300.
See for yourself at BotoxCosmetic.com.
Campfire season's back, and that means s'mores. But when you're at home treating yourself, take them over ice with Dunkin' S'mores Cold Brew Concentrate. And suddenly you're always treating yourself. The home with Dunkin' is where you want to be. Click or tap the banner to shop now.
But if your argument is you're a bad guy and we need to do something about it immediately, right? I think most people would still accept the idea of someone can be arrested and put in jail and held there for a while, and maybe it turns out they're not a bad guy. But the trade-off is we're willing to accept immediate action to protect society. In the case of people we think would be violent, bad, right? I mean, you have people who are alleged murderers and they're held without bond, and it turns out maybe they didn't do it. But that's a trade-off that we're okay in accepting. And so I think there's a reasonable argument here. If you've got a violent gang member, you ought to be able to apprehend them immediately. Now, that said, you still have to deliver the due process. The bigger issue there is, and we're deporting you to somewhere when you can't come back and we can't get you back and you have no due process there. But the court says, now you will. That's the bigger problem. But the first question, does the president have the authority to get people off the streets who he thinks are here illegally and members of foreign criminal gangs? I think that answer is going to be yes. And I think, and you're right, that this is because there are sort of multiple questions here. It's better to kind of let it bubble up through the courts, and we can get rid of the nationwide TRO, so you still have the vigorous executive that Hamilton hoped for, but you also have the preservation of civil liberties in terms of these due process protections.
In reading the opinion, it almost seemed to me that the dissenters and the majority were looking at not two different cases exactly, but the argument from the dissenters basically was that the majority is completely misreading what kind of a case this is, because the majority was saying, well, this is a habeas case, and that you always have the right to question, right, that your imprisonment, your detention. Yeah. And they're saying that, well, no, if you read, the plaintiffs aren't challenging their detention. They're not even seeking release. They're challenging the legality of the removal order that led to their detention. And so therefore, the court in dealing with this can't answer the question it wants to answer. It has to answer the question presented to it. And it's not the habeas question. It's the question of the use of the law itself. And so it was just interesting to me how very differently the two sides in this looked at just the nature of the case itself.
Yeah. So the other thing to consider, right, is there's the use of the law question. I think there's going to be a lot of factual stuff that gets mixed up in that. So it's not a great thing to do on a TRO. The due process habeas piece is more susceptible to that immediate type of relief, to say, hey, look, okay, the idea of TRO, of course, is to maintain a status quo. So, if the court's just looking at that piece of it, then now part of the TRO and injunctions generally, that, as we've said a zillion times over, is the likelihood of success on the merits eventually. And I think that's where the dissenters go, that, look, you just don't have that likelihood of success. I would tend to agree with the majority that, look, you've prevented the irreparable harm if you provide the due process, and you can let the other question bubble up. But no, I think it's right that they're sort of looking at this as two different cases, two different problems. The other thing, right, is there some other presidential authority that the president could do this under? I think probably yes, and maybe that's the better solution, right, under current immigration laws or just general law enforcement, right? Would you have the ability to get these folks off street? Now, that would not necessarily give you the immediate deportation, which is what Trump wants, but it answers the first part of the question.
Yeah. I think one other thing I'll point out,
and I think to a lot of Americans, that's the bigger piece, that listen, if there are dangerous criminal foreign gangs infiltrating America, we want to stop them, and we can, whether we imprison them in a U.S. prison, whether we put them in Gitmo or somewhere else for the time being, till we grant them the due process and the rights and the hearings that they're required. Okay.
Well, maybe the U.S. thing, but not necessarily. I don't know. I'd be the same for the Gitmo thing.
You don't agree with the Gitmo thing, there. Okay?
But yeah, I mean, it also the other
what
thing.
I'm saying, I think that's an easier sell constitutionally, or under the authority of the act, than the immediate summary deportation. It's
just this whole thing of kind of under cover of darkness, whisking people away where even attorneys don't know where they are. They don't have a chance. That just sends a chill down my spine.
Well, and the idea that, in a jurisdiction, then once it's happened, you can't challenge it, that sort of thing.
Yeah, exactly.
So no, I would tend to think that the court gets this one right. And like I said, if the score is nationwide injunction 0, due process 1, then I'm all in favor of it.
The other point I wanted to make is that the one other thing the court did is said that they need to change the venue. It was brought in the D.C. circuit, and this needs to go to D.C. district court. It has to go to Texas, because that was where the actual the folks were being held beforehand. And that's important, because that means it would
creates a U.S. venue to challenge these. Things.
And so when it is appealed, whatever the district court decides, and it almost certainly will be, that appeal will go to the Fifth Circuit as opposed to the D.C. Circuit, and that does make potentially a pretty big difference because, of course, the Fifth Circuit probably the most conservative appellate court, the D.C. Circuit much less so.
Yeah, I think that's right. But on these kind of questions, even on a I don't think you would see that much of a. You look, I suppose, if we're talking about the validity of the statute question, even there, I don't know that you get that much of a distinction between a decision come out of the Fifth Circuit and coming out of the D.C. Circuit.
Well, I don't know. I think I think
on some of these, certainly on some of these fundamental questions, I think the due process is due process. I don't think,
I agree in the due process thing, but I think on the question of whether or not the president can use the law in the first place, you could see some very, whether that I could see the Fifth Circuit ruling very differently on that than the D.C. Circuit. Put it that way.
But wouldn't you agree though that the issue there, which is why I think the majority gets it right, is that there is some facts to be found, right? Because it may well be that the gang is functioning as an agent of a foreign government, and therefore this does qualify as a predatory incursion sponsored by a foreign power. So I that's what I'm saying. I think that
I guess I see what you're saying.
Actual stuff it can turn on. Yeah.
We hope you enjoyed this preview of our supporters exclusive midweek show. If you'd like to hear the rest of the episode, we hope you'll consider becoming a supporter. Supporters get ad-free access to all of our shows, membership in our Politics Guys Discord group where you can join in on the conversation, and other benefits at different levels of support. To become a supporter, go to patreon.com/politicsguys. You can also support us through Venmo or @politicsguys or through PayPal. You'll find all of our support links in the show notes as well as at politicsguys.com/support. And if you'd like to get the midweek show, but you're not in a position to become a financial supporter, that's not a problem. Just send me an email at mike@politicsguys.com, and I'll be happy to get that set up for you.
This podcast is part of the Democracy Group,